Years experience in autism advocacy and government relations for Autism Speaks. Since 2002, he has served as an appointed member of the Kansas Governor's Commission on Autism. In 2006, Mike founded the Kansas Coalition for Autism Legislation and grew its membership to over 1,500 advocates. This organization was the driving force behind legislation that created the Kansas Autism Task Force, where Mike chaired the subcommittee on insurance, and passage of House Bill 2160, which required coverage for applied behavior analysis services for Kansas state employees. Since joining Autism Speaks in 2011, Mike has helped lead the passage of autism insurance reform laws in several states and successfully advocated for the addition of meaningful autism coverage in multiple self-funded health benefit plans, and created the Autism Speaks Insurance Link, an online tool to help families determine whether their policies provide coverage for applied behavior analysis services. He has a Bachelor of Science degree from Loyola University, Maryland, and he's also a Doctor of Veterinary Medicine from The Ohio State University. In addition to these amazing accomplishments, Mike is also the father of 2 children, including a teenager with autism. He's here today. I'm not sure if everyone in the audience is aware, but Ohio has passed some autism insurance reform, and we have Mike here to hopefully shed some light on what that means for us coming down the pipeline. So thank you for coming, Mike.
Good morning. I'm probably going to make the AV guy mad at me, but I am going to have to step forward a little bit so I can see the slide. All right. Okay. Thank you very much, Joel. I appreciate being here. I always start with this slide because these two are the reason why I do what I do. Kate was diagnosed with autism when she was 2.5. At the time, she had the development of a 6-month-old, but she was prescribed applied behavior analysis, occupational therapy, speech therapy, and what got me into the advocacy gig was the fact that, as Joel mentioned, I'm a veterinarian. I had good health insurance, and I thought, after we got the diagnosis of autism, I thought, well, at least I've got good health insurance, and it's going to cover everything that's prescribed for her. Well, I got a serious wake-up call, but I was very fortunate that I was in a position, financially, that we could scrape together enough money to pay out of pocket what she was prescribed. And the upshot of that is that she is fortunate enough to be among the 50% of kids who, when receive appropriate treatment, she was able to mainstream by the time she started in 1st grade in regular education. She's now graduating from high school this year with a 4.3 grade point average and is heading off to the University of Iowa next fall in their honors program. Thank you. She still has autism. She still struggles. She still struggles socially with independent living skills. And frankly, I'm terrified that she's going away 5 hours, but I have to get over it and cut the cord. But it's also important that I have my son in this picture too. Although he does not have autism, siblings of children with autism struggle too. It is a very hard situation to be in. Kate was diagnosed when my wife was pregnant with Sam, so he hit the ground in the middle of chaos, and he's a great little brother, but it's always important to recognize what our siblings go through. Okay, so very briefly an overview of what I hope to accomplish today, and I do want to keep this conversational. So throughout the program, you all have any questions, please raise your hand, and we'll address this as we go. But I do hope to have you all gain a basic understanding of health insurance plan types and how coverage for autism is affected by the type of plan you have. Give you an update, as Joel mentioned, on the status of coverage for treatment here in Ohio, treatment for autism here in Ohio. And to understand the importance that, although we celebrated when Ohio passed their bill becoming the 45th state, you're not done. That's just the first step, because there are significant issues across the country, even where we have passed meaningful autism insurance reform, on implementation and enforcement. And what I mean by that is holding the insurance companies accountable for complying with the laws that have been passed. So very briefly, I wanted to show this graphic, which demonstrates the different kinds of health insurance plans that are out there. And the percentages on this slide are not necessarily Ohio-specific. These just kind of a general representation across the country. I like to think of it typically in kind of 30% portions of the pie. A big portion of the pie are these fully insured plans. These are plans that are regulated by state law. These are the plans that were affected when Ohio passed their law last year. And that includes large group plans, small group plans, and individual plans. And we're going to talk a little bit more in detail about that and what it means to be a fully insured plan in just a minute. Then another big portion of the pie are the self-funded health benefit plans. These are plans that are not regulated by the state, but by the federal government. These are plans that are typically issued by companies who have greater than 200 employees. And again, we're going to talk about that in just a minute and how we can affect change in those plans since they aren't subject to the law that we just passed here in Ohio. Another big portion of the pie are folks that are covered by Medicaid. There's been some exciting developments recently as it relates to coverage for autism through Medicaid we'll talk about later on. And then the small slivers of the pie, the federal employee health benefit plans and TRICARE. So very briefly, I think it's important that we discuss the difference between what it means to be a fully insured plan versus a self-funded plan. You know, I get calls or emails multiple times a day from folks trying to help answer the question as to whether or not they've got coverage, and if they don't, what they can do to fix that. And the very first question I have to ask them is it a fully insured plan or is it self-funded? And the reason is because of the way that they are regulated. Depending on what type of plan you have is going to change how we advocate for the addition of meaningful coverage. And the big difference between the two is which entity is taking the financial risk to pay the claim. In a fully insured plan, although you are paying your premiums and you may not necessarily be using your health insurance every month, all of that money is going to the health insurance companies, and it is ultimately the health insurance company that is taking the financial risk to pay out the claims in a fully insured plan, as opposed to a self-funded plan where it is actually the employer who is taking the financial risk. And we'll get into that a little bit more in a graphic here in just a minute. All right, I'm a Simpsons fan, so I thought this would be appropriate to explain this. But this is a graphic of a fully insured plan, and you're probably familiar with this scenario where Homer is the consumer, he pays his monthly premiums or is taken out of his paycheck from the employer. But the employer has shopped around, and he probably does this, or he or she does this on an annual basis. They shop around and look for a group insurance contract that best fits the needs of his or her employees. And in this case, it is the health insurance company, and I don't necessarily have nothing to do with Blue Cross Blue Shield. It's just the first graphic I could find pulled off the internet. But it is the health insurance company that is taking that financial risk to pay your claims. Individual plans are also considered fully insured. The only difference between this and the previous scenario is that we've taken the employer out of the picture. The consumer simply goes directly to an insurance company and buys an individual plan as opposed to a group plan. But in this case, again, it is the insurance company that is taking the financial risk to pay your claims. So say, for instance, I developed cancer and I was prescribed chemotherapy and I had $100,000 worth of bills in chemotherapy. Although I am paying my monthly premiums, I'm not the one that is paying that $100,000 at the end of the day. It is the insurance company. Now, before you feel sorry for them, as I mentioned, they're collecting premiums from people every day who aren't using their health insurance company. So believe me, they're not losing money on you. So this contrasts with a self-funded health benefit plan. Again, you've got the consumer who has his monthly premiums taken out of his paycheck by the employer. But in this case, the employer is big enough. Think of like Sprint or Home Depot, big companies like that. They have the financial wherewithal to set aside a pool of money that they use to pay their employees' claims. But because they're not necessarily, Home Depot isn't in the business of administering health insurance, they have to contract out with what's referred to as a third-party administrator to administer the health benefit claims for them, to pay the claims out, to do the contracting with providers, that sort of thing. That third-party administrator is frequently a health insurance company, like Blue Cross Blue Shield. So the only difference there is that although there is a health insurance company in the picture with a self-funded plan, they are not the ones taking the financial risk to insure you. It is your employer. So how can you tell? Because if this is an example of two health insurance cards that you're getting, the one on the left is from a company that provides a fully insured plan. The one on the right provides a self-funded health benefit plan. But because that self-funded plan uses Blue Cross Blue Shield as a third-party administrator, your card's going to look identical. There are some states, because of the importance of knowing the difference of what type of plan you have, there are some states that require that the health insurance companies put on the card whether it is fully insured or self-funded. Ohio is not one of those. So because of that, how are you going to know what kind of plan you have? You could look at your summary plan description. By law, those are supposed to be written at a 5th grade level. I've looked at a bunch of these, and I've got a couple degrees, and I can tell you they are not written at a 5th grade level. And so you're probably not going to be able to figure out by looking at that what kind of plan you have. So the quickest way to do this would be to probably call your HR department. If you get a hold of the right person in HR, they should be able to tell you what kind of plan you have. All right, so get kind of the boring definition stuff out of the way. Quick update on where we are in Ohio with coverage for the treatment of autism. Frequently, our discussion revolves around coverage for applied behavior analysis. Being at this school, you probably are very familiar with this, so I'm not going to spend too much time on what ABA is. But, for years, and it just came up actually this week, in a debate in South Carolina, where although they passed a bill several years ago, where they were actually the third state to pass insurance reform, their bill then only applied to state employees and large group plans. They're now trying to expand that to small group and individual plans. There are still, the insurance companies are still running around there saying, well, ABA is experimental. It is not experimental. It's been around for decades, and there are volumes and volumes of evidence behind it. I'm not going to talk about what it is, you know that. But one question that we do frequently get is, Autism Speaks, when we're working in states or working with health insurance, working with companies to try to get them to add a benefit, all the discussion seems to come back to a discussion of ABA. So we frequently get, is that all you advocate for? Are there other services out there? And the answer is no. And if you look at our model bill, actually we refer to behavioral health treatment as a broad category, which includes, but not limited to, applied behavior analysis. But the fact of the matter is, ABA is the most commonly prescribed evidence-based treatment for autism, and short of a law requiring coverage for it, it is the one that is invariably denied coverage. So that's why the discussion revolves around that. But we do recognize that speech therapy, physical therapy, occupational therapy, many kids with autism have comorbid conditions like anxiety, depression, OCD that require psychological and psychiatric care or pharmaceutical care. So we recognize that. But to some extent, even if there isn't a law, there is going to be at least some limited coverage for these things under your health insurance plan. Now, say, for example, speech, physical therapy, OT, that might be limited to 20 visits a year, which for a kid with autism is not adequate. So in our efforts to pass legislation, we try to remove those limits for those services. This is just a quick timeline as to what's happened here in Ohio. Probably the first effort was back in 2009. with the Please case, which was the Parents League for Effective Autism Services, where they sued Medicaid for not covering applied behavior analysis under EPSDT. They did find that ABA is a coverable service and should be covered, but because that settled out of court, that helped the kids who were in that lawsuit, but it didn't extend to everybody in Medicaid. The folks in Ohio have been working to get an insurance bill passed for over a decade. Back in 2012, Governor Kasich, who has been incredibly supportive of the autism community here in Ohio, and we really appreciate that, he signed an executive order back in 2012 that required coverage for applied behavior analysis and other services for autism in state employee health benefit plans and in qualified health plans. And what I mean by that are those are the plans you can get through the exchange or Obamacare plans. But we still had a portion of the pie, if you look back at the chart we looked at earlier, that wasn't covered. That would be the large group plans and grandfathered small group and individual plans. And that was what we recently got passed. We extended that coverage to those plans back in last year. Okay, I'll talk more in detail as we move along here. I probably already covered these things, but this just shows more in detail what Governor Kasich's executive action accomplished. It did require coverage. What we actually did was, in the Affordable Care Act, there are 10 categories of services that are considered essential health benefits. Those aren't specific benefits, they're simply categories of benefits. But states had the option, and still have the option, to clarify what services should be covered under a particular category. And what the governor's office did was to take advantage of that flexibility and define the category of habilitative services to include coverage for clinical therapeutic intervention, which includes applied behavior analysis. There are caps on that of up to 20 hours. Well, actually, at a minimum, so it's not necessarily a hard cap, but they have to provide at least 20 hours a week of clinical therapeutic intervention. Speech therapy, occupational therapy, and psychological and psychiatric services through age 21. And again, that applied both qualified health plans and state employee plans. House Bill 463, which was passed last year, again, extended coverage to the rest of the fully insured plans that were not addressed by the governor's order. And the terms of coverage are identical except for an age cap. There is an age cap of 14 on those services. Now, when we go into the process of legislation, we have the perfect bill, but by the time you get through the legislative process and several committee hearings, often what you wind up is not what you hope to get, and that was the case with our bill here in Ohio. The bill that we had filed had removed all caps on services, but that was not palatable to some legislators, and they imposed a cap of 14. So, parents in the room, does autism go away at 14? No, doesn't go away at 14. So what I would encourage you to do, if you have an older child, whether you're a parent or a provider, is to request for, if you're a provider, submit the prior authorizations for what the child needs, regardless of what the caps are, regardless of the age cap or dollar cap. And if you get a denial because they've exceeded a cap, please let me know, because I think there are things that we can do to try to address that, because probably, there is an argument to be made that those caps are probably a violation of federal mental health parity law. So we could probably work with that. But again, when Ohio passed their bill, or your bill, you became the 45th state to require coverage for autism. We are currently very active in Alabama, where last week they passed the House 100-0. We're running into some blocks right now in the Senate, So if you've got any connections in Alabama, if you have buddies with any Alabama legislators, please let me know, because we're going to need all the help we can get. All right, so again, another big portion of that pie are Medicaid plans. I mentioned the Please case back in 2008, 2009. But it's important to remember that there is a benefit under Medicaid called EPSDT, which stands for Early Periodic Screening, Diagnosis, and Treatment. That was added to Medicaid back in the late 80s. And what EPSDT states is that Medicaid-eligible children aged 0 to 21 must receive all medically necessary treatments to ameliorate their condition, regardless of what that service is, as long as it's coverable under Medicaid. That applies to kids with autism as well, but until 2014, on the heels of a couple lawsuits across the country against state Medicaid directors for not providing coverage for the treatment of autism under EPSDT, CMS, who is the federal overseer of Medicaid, put out a bulletin reminding state Medicaid offices. Basically, it said, hey, there's this thing called EPSDT out there, and it also applies to kids with autism. So if your state gets sued for not providing coverage for the treatment of autism, you're on your own, because we've reminded you that this is your obligation. On the heels of the bulletin in 2014, there are about 38 states that have taken affirmative action, including Ohio, to clarify that when medically necessary, ABA is a covered benefit for Medicaid-eligible children. Ohio just put out their rule back in April, and I believe there's some hearings coming up on that proposed rule, and coverage should go into effect July of this year. Federal employee health benefit plans, which, although a relatively small sliver of the pie, several years ago, they had considered, OPM, which is the administrator of federal employee health benefit plans, considered applied behavior analysis an educational benefit. And because of that designation, they would not allow it to be a covered service through medical health insurance. However, after reviewing the data, they came to the conclusion several years ago that no, this is not an educational benefit, this is a medical benefit, and therefore reimbursable through their plans. But they fell short of requiring coverage in all federal employee plans at that time. So some of the plans did adopt coverage for it, others didn't, but only after about a year and a half or two, OPM came out last year and said, hey, beginning January 1 of 2017, all federal employee health benefit plans must require coverage for applied behavior analysis, which was a very exciting development because there's over 8 million people in the country that are covered by a federal employee plan. TRICARE provides coverage for applied behavior analysis through a demonstration project. In 2015, capstone services were removed. I do understand, however, that there are some ongoing issues with TRICARE. So if you're a parent that's covered under TRICARE or a provider that works with TRICARE and having issues, please let me know, and I can try to give you some guidance on that. So if you go back to our pie, Ohio's done a pretty amazing job because you've got almost the entire pie that requires coverage for applied behavior analysis. The only portion that isn't completely covered are the self-funded health benefit plans. Again, these are plans that are federally regulated. And until there is a federal law that amends ERISA, which is the law that regulates these plans, until there is a law that amends ERISA to require coverage, what we're going to have to do is go company to company and advocate at the level of your employer to get that benefit added. If you look at across the country, there's approximately 40% of self-funded health benefit plans have already adopted a benefit. If you look back 10 years ago, that was probably about 10%. But because of all the activity we've seen in fully insured plans across the country and federal employee plans and Medicaid, a lot of these self-funded companies have recognized that in order to remain competitive in retaining quality employees, they have to add a similar benefit. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about what you can do if you happen to be covered by a self-funded health benefit plan that does not require this coverage. Again, because these are federally regulated, we could affect the change by amending federal law. But also think back to that graphic as to who is taking the financial risk to pay your claims. Because it is the employer that is taking the financial risk to pay your claims, they, if they choose to, can add the benefit. You know, if they're paying for it, they can add whatever they want. You could also sue, which I wouldn't necessarily recommend. Kind of put yourself at risk. So typically, what we have found most successful is advocating at the level of the employer. And what I will tell you is that if you happen to work for one of these companies and you don't have a benefit for ABA, in my experience, it's very unlikely that the company has made a conscious decision not to cover ABA. It's simply that nobody has ever brought it to their attention that this is a benefit that their employees might need. But you're not going to get it unless you ask for it, and that's where we can help. The first step is to go online, and I provided a URL for that. We have put together a pretty comprehensive toolkit. Autism Speaks has a toolkit for everything online. We've got a self-funded employer toolkit, and that would be the first thing to do, because in there we have several sample letters that you are welcome to cut and paste that provides an initial reach out to your employer to say, hey, here's what I'm asking for, here's evidence behind ABA, here's why this is important to my family. Because what you want to do is request a meeting. Try to get a meeting with, we used to say just to get a meeting with your HR department, but some HR departments are very big. If you happen to get a meeting with somebody in HR that doesn't necessarily work in health benefits, it's not going to help you a whole bunch. So what I would suggest is if you can get a meeting with the HR department, ask for the head of benefits, or preferably if you have a connection in the executive chain at your company, if you know the president of the company and you can get a meeting with them and make a compelling case to add this benefit, all the president needs to do is go to the HR department and says add the benefit, and it's a done deal. You may not necessarily, yeah, go ahead. Oh, I'm sorry, questions? Yeah. It's a little hard to find because we've reshuffled our website, but that link should be effective there. And you can, I'll have my email address at the end too, and you're welcome to email me directly and I can provide it for you. Good. I understand, as a parent myself, when I first got into the advocacy gig, I wouldn't have felt comfortable speaking in front of a legislature, and I wouldn't feel comfortable talking to my, HR department about this benefit, nor would I expect you all to feel comfortable with that necessarily either. So we will help you. We've got these resources online, but we will also be happy to come out and be your wingman in these meetings. There's no charge to you as the employee. There's no charge to your employer for us to do that. We'd be happy to join you in these meetings. We have included in the toolkit a PowerPoint presentation that, if you feel comfortable presenting it yourself, you're welcome to do that. Or if you don't, like I said, we'll come in and help you. But it's got some very basic information in there. And you have to understand that, you're living and breathing autism every day, but your employer might necessarily know anything about autism. But so it's got some basic information. What is autism? How is it treated? What's applied behavior analysis? You know, I've been doing advocacy for a decade, and it's still very difficult for me to give a layman's description of what ABA is. And, you know, so I rely on videos of, you know, an ABA session and talk through that. It includes research on the efficacy of ABA to try to refute assertions that we still hear to this day that, you know, ABA is experimental. But from an employer's perspective, again, who's taking the financial risk to pay your claims, they're going to want to know how much it costs. And because there are now 45 states that have been doing this for about a decade, and a large number of self-funded companies that are providing this coverage, we have actual claims data that we can share with your company that will show to them that, yeah, paying out of pocket, it's very painful to, you know, if we're talking $50,000, $60,000 a year plus for a severely affected child. When you look at distributing that cost throughout the entire population of covered lives, we're talking on the order of 50 cents per member per month. And that is reliable claims data that we've collected from across the country. You know, and putting it in perspective, you know, it's a little bit more palatable for a company to pull the trigger and add the benefit. The toolkit also includes some employer testimonials. This happens to be from a hospital chain in Missouri. You know, clearly there are powerful economic and social arguments for providing this benefit. We know that if families have coverage for their children, they're going to be better employees. You know, I'm very lucky that, you know, when Kate was diagnosed, that I also happened to be a partner in my veterinary practice, because if I weren't a partner, I think my job would have been at risk. You know, I was not a very productive employee at the time. You know, I was completely distracted. You know, I was constantly getting the 911 calls from home and having to leave early, and it's a very difficult time for a parent to be holding down a job, holding down a family, and finding out how to pay for your child's services out of pocket. So by providing coverage for the services that your child has been prescribed by a medical doctor provides a lot of relief for these families. If you do get a meeting, I would encourage you to ask these questions. First is how much time you're going to have. You know, you may only have 10 minutes, or you may have 30 minutes, but it's going to totally change your presentation. We frequently refer to these elevator speeches in the legislature, because sometimes when you're trying to track down a legislator, you literally have the time it takes to get from one floor to the other on the elevator to make your pitch. But I would also ask who will be attending from the company. You know, if I'm going to go to these meetings, I like to consider myself a little bit of an internet sleuth, and you know, if I know who is going to be at the meeting, I do a little bit of background research on them. You know, if they happen to have gone to the same undergrad that I did, or you know, we have some sort of connection, you know, it's a way to personalize the meeting and get it kicked off a little bit better. You know what their titles are, you know, where they worked previously, if they happen to work for an insurance company previously, you know, that can be helpful. I also like to look for their mission statements. Most large companies have something published online as it relates to their mission statement. You know, I'm not trying to be sneaky, but I think that if there are, you know, statements in their mission statement to the effect that, you know, they value employee satisfaction, employee well-being, you know, well, what we're asking is very consistent with your mission statement. And, you know, I can kind of slip some comments in there that, you know, might make the decision more easy for them. What we will also do is help you to research competitors. What are other competitors in the field providing as it relates to coverage for autism? We have that information. You know, we know what other hospital chains are providing. We know information geographically as well. We can tell you what your competitors in your geographic region are providing as well. Because oftentimes a company doesn't want to be the first one to do this. They want to know what their other competitors are doing. Common questions I get are, first, should it just be me, or should I see if there are other affected families in my company that would benefit from this? I don't have a right or wrong answer, but what I would say is, going back to finding out who's going to be at the meeting from the company's side, if you will, always have at least a couple less people on your side, because what you don't want to do is go in there with, I live with an autism mom, and I know that they can be very forceful. So what you don't want to do is go in with an angry mob of autism moms and have like 2 people from the company on the other side of the table, or you're going to scare them to death. So have a couple less people on your side. The other question is, should I bring my affected child? You might be in a situation where you can't get child care for your child to come to a meeting. I had previously been of the mindset that it's probably a bad idea, because this is a very emotional topic. It's sometimes a confusing topic. And, if you've got a child with autism in there who, has, self-stimulatory behavior and is vocalizing and not sitting in the chair, you're trying to make a point, and that point may be lost because of the distraction. But my mind was changed after a meeting that I had. It was actually a dad who worked for a municipality in Indiana. He was a county employee. It was a blue-collar family, very limited income. Both parents were working. They had a very severely affected child who was probably about 14 or 15. And they said, we've got to bring her. Is that okay? And 10 minutes? Okay, perfect. We've got to bring her. And I said, we'll bring her. You got to do what you got to do. So it was just me and the mom and dad and the daughter on one side, and 3 company representatives on the other side. And typically the way I start out these meetings are simply have the parents share their personal experience. It's very important for your employer to understand what you live day in and day out, how it affects not just your child, but autism affects the family, and what the importance of having appropriate health insurance coverage. So the mom and dad are telling their story. The entire time, their daughter was nonverbal, but she was vocalizing and flapping her hands, and I thought, oh my goodness, they're never going to pay attention to what I'm saying. But then by the time it was my turn to talk and give the PowerPoint presentation and what is ABA and the evidence base behind it and the costs, they didn't care. They were in 2 of the 3 of the company people were in tears before I ever had a chance to talk, and they said, okay, we'll do it. It was like, I didn't even need to be there. They just had to share their story. And I think that's a really important point is, like I said, your company, very unlikely that they made a conscious decision not to cover ABA. They've got a big company. They do a lot of things. They probably simply relied on the third-party administrator for the most part to design their benefit plan. And third-party administrators, being insurance companies, aren't going to offer up, hey, why don't you cover ABA? So you really, like I said, going back to the cartoon, you won't get it if you don't ask for it. Share your story, and you'll be surprised how effective that can be. This is a slide that I used at a company. It was Darden, which is a large restaurant chain out of Florida. As I mentioned, I do a little bit of background research on the company before the meeting, and found out that they had just been awarded one of Forbes' top 100 companies to work for. They were number 99 on that list, but they were really proud of it. So we keep a list of companies that we have been able to document, provide coverage for ABA. And I thought, well, I'm going to go through and see which one of those are also on that list. So I highlighted those. Those are the ones in orange there. And when I got to this slide, their eyes perked up. And I think is what sold them on the value of this was just doing a little bit of background research on the company. So if they do say yes, please let me know, because this information isn't publicly available. It's very difficult to find out from is that a question or a 5-minute mark? Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were saying 5 minutes. Yeah. Yeah, it is going to be a problem. I mean, there is frankly going to be a lag period, and we've seen that across the country where we pass a state, and sometimes lawmakers will use that in opposition to what we're trying to do. You know, for example, we're working in Alabama, and they're saying, well, you don't have enough providers if we do this. I'm like, well, we don't now because there's no incentive for providers to live in Alabama because there's no funding stream for them. But, you know, if you've seen Field of Dreams, you build it, they will come, and that absolutely is true. You know, if you provide a mechanism to be reimbursed, providers are going to have the incentive to come in and be there. But it is going to be a lag period, but I'm certain that you're going to see an uptick in the number of providers in Ohio after this bill passed. I'm going to skip that. And just a quick comment on implementation and enforcement. You know, as I mentioned, you know, very exciting that you were able to pass this bill in Ohio. I'm not trying to be a buzzkill, but that's the first step because insurance companies, no offense to any insurance representatives here in the audience, but they are always finding ways to not comply with the law. And I would make a plea as a parent to the providers in the audience to, to the best of your ability, be your client's advocate. Because when Kate was diagnosed and we sent in claims for her services, and we got the denials. I did an appeal, and I got a denial, and I'm like, all right, I'm done. I rolled over at that time because, like I said, I've got an infant that just hit the ground in the middle of mayhem. I'm trying to work, and yes, it'd be great if my insurance would pay for this, but I don't have the emotional wherewithal nor the knowledge to fight my insurance companies throughout all this too. But that's what they count on. Insurance companies count on the fact that you're going to roll over after the first or second denial. Don't do that. And ask your provider to help you to put together an appeal. We can also, to some extent, we being Autism Speaks, can also help you with the appeals process. We look at a lot of these across the country and can try to put something together for you. If you are a provider, I would ask that you, if you're on Facebook, there is a group called ABA Therapy Billing and Insurance Help, and every day there are examples of denials on there and how to appeal those effectively. There is also a listserv that we put together as it relates to, I'm going to skip that, we're running out of time. The Autism Law Summit is an annual event that started out about 11 or 12 years ago after Laura Unum, who's my vice president, was successfully passed an autism insurance reform bill in South Carolina. And it was intended, started out small, like 15, 20 people, as a way for her to share how they got their bill passed in South Carolina. I somehow came across her name online. I flew to Columbia, South Carolina, and sat in on this meeting, and that's kind of what got me charged up about this. But now that there are 45 states, it has shifted somewhat from how to pass a law to how to implement the law. And so much of the focus is about the appeals process and billing and credentialing and all those sort of things. So if there are any providers in the room or parents who are interested, it's going to be in San Diego this year, October 27th, 29th. But because these are ongoing discussions, we've set up a listserv for people who have attended this in the past to share their experiences as well. All right, I think I'm just about out of time, but I'm happy to answer any questions. If you think of something later, please email me or call me. Very happy to take, questions regarding your personal situation if you'd like. All right. All righty, well, thanks very much.